Welcome back to LifeLink. Lesson 9 tonight. We jump into some family responsibilities. You know, the joy of being part of a family is there's definitely privileges. I mean, you just think about that as when you're born into a family, right? Or you become part of a family, maybe through adoption, whatever the means is, right? And we become part of a family. And you know, one of the blessings that I've always had, and probably almost all of us had as being part of a family growing up, is you come to dinner or you come to lunch and there's food on the table. You know, as an infant, you had a shelter over your head. But, you know, as you grew up in a home, I'm thankful, and I'm sure you are as well, if you were taught some responsibilities to go along with that. You imagine if nobody did anything in the home? I mean, how quickly our homes would fall apart. What a mess they'd be. No one did the dishes, right? No one made their beds or cleaned their rooms or took out the garbage or any of those things, right? Our homes would quickly become in ruins, right? And so there's family responsibilities. And that even involves how we relate to one another. And the interactions that we have with each other. There's responsibilities to keep the family of God, just as in our human families, healthy and harmonious. And sometimes, in the ones that we're going to look at tonight, there's actually two of them. In 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're going to summarize and kind of pick up the speed of our study with 1 Timothy 5 and then chapter 6 next week and just highlight some of these responsibilities. But two main responsibilities in chapter 5. We've already seen how these relationships begin, and now we get into the responsibilities. And the first one is to honor widows that are really widows, or widows indeed. Look at it in verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows, or who are widows indeed. They'd be put on an official list, if you will, in the church, and the church would then care for them because they're truly, truly widows, which implies there's more than they've just lost a spouse. There's going to be some additional conditions for them to be put on this list, right? Honor widows who are really widows is what he's saying here. So the term widow is used metaphorically of a city that has been stripped of its inhabitants and its resources. You know, all widows, in a sense, have lost their husbands. But widows indeed, widows who are really widows, have not only lost their husband, their spouse, but they are truly alone and without any resources. And we'll see that as we go through this in a little bit. And these widows are to be honored. It's an imperative. The term means fixing a value upon something or someone. And implied in this term is to provide resources and care for those who are being honored. Just like even the way we were to honor those that are older as father and mother in the previous two verses that we looked at last week. But then you go on to the end of the chapter, verses 17 through 24, and we're not going to cover this, but I just want to show it to you again. It's honor the elders. And it's talking there about, again, the spiritual leaders. And we covered that when we talked about the role of the spiritual leaders. So tonight what we're going to do is focus on this 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16. And since we're going to try to cover this passage, here's what I want you to do. I want you to just take it as a group and maybe break it up into two portions, but have your group read 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16. And as you're reading it, try to identify those who are widows indeed. What are some of the characteristics of those who are really widows and are to be added to this list that the church then was commanded to honor and to care for? All right? So take just a few moments after you read it to briefly answer that question. If you answer it too much, well, you might not need the rest of the lesson. But take a few moments to at least try to list some of those points, and then we'll pick it up with the rest of the lesson in just a moment. Well, I'm sure you maybe have already seen some of these points here as you've listed who is a widow indeed, or who is really a widow. But let me just share with you at least three of the characteristics here. First, number one, widows indeed have no children or grandchildren to care for them. Look at it again in verse 4. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents. That's good and acceptable before God, right? Verse 8, and this is a powerful verse. If anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith. Boy, you can see the importance of caring for those in our own family, especially our parents and our grandparents. He's worse than an unbeliever, it says. Those are some serious, powerful words. It might be common for unbelievers not to care for their own, to dishonor their parents or grandparents during their latter years, but that is not what Christ taught. That's not godliness in our responsibilities in the family. And verse 16 summarized it as well. If any believing man or woman has widows, in other words, if any have widows, man or woman, if you have a widow in your family, right, let the family, if you will, the children, the grandchildren, relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. In other words, the really widows have no children or grandchildren. So if you have family, that family is supposed to care for them first, so that the church is not burdened. And then you go on, another characteristic of widows indeed, and it's widows indeed are 60 years of age or older. Verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. In other words, they're not going to be considered widows indeed. Now, why this age requirement? Well, I think the text provides the answer for us. And it's in his counsel to the younger widows, all right, those that would be under this age, which is found in verses 11 through 15, but specifically the application is in verses 14 and 15, where Paul says, therefore I desire the younger widows married. In other words, he's saying it's very appropriate, and by the way, any aged widow can get remarried, right? But he's saying here, it's appropriate and even encouraged, and it's his desire, it's his command, right? His desire for them that the younger widows marry, and then they bear children. The younger widows are able to through marriage, and then perhaps, depending on their age and whatnot, childbearing, to not be alone. Their deficiency of resources and people could be provided in another way, and that way would be through another human family, by getting remarried and bearing children, then taking care of that house, and so on and so forth. And then there's a third characteristic of the widows indeed. Widows indeed have a testimony of good works, both in the home and beyond. And you see that in verses 9 and 10. First it talks about the age requirement, and then it says at the end of verse 9, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. In other words, she has been a faithful wife, well reported of for good works. If she has brought up children. In other words, as a wife, she is, if God gave children to the home, she's been a faithful mom. If she has lodged strangers, using her house for hospitality. If she has washed the saints' feet, hospitality for the unbeliever, lodging strangers, hospitality for the believers, washing the saints' feet. If she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. And so specifically, these works, again, focusing even back on the works of the lady, the good works found back in 1 Timothy 2, right? Where it's even seen in the home, and that's the focus of her work. If you contrast that with the temptation the younger widows might face, they would wander from house to house instead of fulfilling this responsibility even in the home. So widows indeed have a good testimony of good works, both in the home and beyond. This is who the church is to honor. They don't have children or grandchildren that can care for them. They're over the age of 60. Therefore, it's unlikely for them to be able to start their own family again, right? Or harder for that, at least. And then they have a testimony in their first 59 plus years, 60 years after they were married, they were faithful, they used the home that God placed them in, and they fulfilled that responsibility well. So let's think of some application now of these truths. What are some applications of these truths for us to consider tonight as we think about family responsibilities? And obviously there's a connection here between the church family, right, how we conduct ourselves in the house of God, and the human family. So let's look at them. Number one, we as a church must honor widows that are widows indeed. I think we, even though we're 2,000 years later than when Paul wrote, this still is applicable for us today, right? And we're not to necessarily care for all widows, right? But the ones that meet those qualifications, we're to honor them, fix a value on them, esteem them highly for how they've lived, how they've conducted themselves, the work they've accomplished, and to honor that by caring for them and providing for them as we are able to do that. You know, one of the ways that I think we as a church are set up for that is even through our deacon caring program, where even if any widow has a need, they have somebody they can go to. Now that deacon might not be able to provide it all, but then we can meet as spiritual leaders and we can take care of that. And we can share the need within the body of Christ as well. But one of the things this is saying is, as a church, we are to have a special heart for widows. Those that are alone, if you will, in that sense. I think of James 1:27, pure religion, undefiled before God, is this, right? And it talks about the widows and the orphans, right? And to minister to them. Remembering that God places the solitary in families. And that leads us even to the second application, which is so applicable in this chapter. Yes, we as a church are to honor widows that are widows indeed. But secondly, and you can see this throughout the chapter, believers must fulfill family responsibilities. For the church family not to be extra burdened, the human family has to be functioning well. Notice the different family relationships that have to be functioning well in this process and that are encouraged throughout this passage. Verse 4, children or grandchildren. So it's the parent-child relationship, right? And then you go into verse 9. You have the wife. She has been the wife of one man. You got the husband-wife relationship. You see, if that husband-wife relationship is broken, in a sense, she's not even qualified to be one of those. That is an important relationship. You see the focus on parents. Even in verse 10, where it talks about bringing up children. You see it back in verse 4, to repay their parents, right? In other words, parents have invested in their children, and some of that's a financial care and so on and so forth. But it's more than that. It's bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then you see it even in the home as being a place of hospitality. And so what we're suggesting here is believers must fulfill their family responsibilities. That's an application of the truths in this passage, which leads to a third truth. And again, it's one of the reasons that you just think about the term TheoFam. There's so many connections between a household of God and a human family, right? But it's this is an important application. Number 3, your family is your primary ministry. Now, in saying that, I'm by no means saying that the church is not a key ministry. But as a member of the household of God, right, your family ministry becomes a priority or a primary ministry. Look at verse 4, and I'll show you why I say this. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them, and notice the next word, what does it say? Let them first learn to show piety at home. That word first gives the idea of before all else. So in other words, before you're involved with other ministries at the church, here's your primary one. Before everything else, first make sure you're showing godliness at home. Let them first learn to show piety where? At home, and to repay their parents. Loving your closest neighbors, the ones that have brought you up, the ones that you live with. You see it also even in the list, the well reported of for good works. It begins, what's the first good work that's mentioned in verse 9? It's the wife of one man, a faithful wife. You know, before ladies, you're able to encourage other younger ladies in the church. You have to have your own marriage relationship in order before you can teach other younger ladies with that, right? Encourage you with that. It's a Titus 2 principle. We've already seen this, by the way, your family as your primary ministry in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 through 5. Right? In 1 Timothy 3, it's again speaking about the elders in the church, the spiritual leaders, and desiring the office of a bishop. That's a good work, right? And ministries in the church and the importance of it, yes, they're important. It's a good work, right? That's what it says in verse 1. But in order to fulfill that work, there's something even more primary. And if you're going to be the office of a bishop, verse 4, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? And you take that into the context of widows. If we can't take care of our own parents, well, then how can we take care of other people's parents and grandparents, right? The widows who are widows indeed, think about it this way as well. They first cared for their own family, right? As a faithful wife, bringing up children. And so just thinking through this importance of the human family, I just want to take a little moment to advertise the TheoFam conference coming up. The last Saturday of the month of August, but the deadline to register is this Thursday, August 22nd. And I'd encourage everybody to be part of it because the family unit, human family, is a primary ministry. Look at verse 8 again of 1 Timothy chapter 5. And this is really a sobering verse. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. But if anyone does not provide for his own, speaking about his own family, you're child or grandchild, and you have a parent or grandparent that has need, and you just don't have any attempt, you don't try to provide for them, you don't care for them. And that's what it says, and it further explains that, especially those of his household, right? He has denied the faith, right? So we are in the household of God, we're to care for it. More than that, especially in your own household, in your own human family. When you don't care for the people and honor the people in your own human family, you've denied the very faith which you have professed to believe. And look at how it ends. And you are worse than an unbeliever. Wow. I would say it this way. Lack of godliness in our family responsibilities is equated with denying the faith. It is only when a widow has no human family that the family of God then steps in. And that's how the passage concludes. And so that's a mindset. And it's a shift because it's oftentimes not taught in our churches today because we're well, you got to serve in the church, you got to serve. And yes, there's a place for that. We need that, right? But there's something primary. We got to be able to take care. We got to be able to live out our faith with our closest neighbors, the one we are living with, right? In our homes. And so this mindset, your family is your primary ministry. Be encouraged with that truth. First, learn to show piety at home. Well, next week, we'll conclude our study with chapter 6 as we look at some more family responsibilities. But for now, prayerfully consider the family responsibilities of honoring widows that are widows indeed And as we do, may we all be reminded of our human family responsibilities. God bless you. See you next week at LifeLink.